In this video, we're going to look at how we can send logs from a .NET 6 Web API to Amazon CloudWatch so that we can have observability in the cloud. Hey everyone, Wes here with Productive Dev. I hope you're doing well. In this episode, we're going to look at a topic that I really enjoy diving into, which is observability. And we're going to look at a logging framework that I really enjoy using called nlog. One of the nice things about using nlog with .NET is that it's very easy to configure. We can configure nlog to write logs to the console, as we are all familiar with when we're debugging. We can also have it write logs to our file system, and we can have it write to sort of any network target that we might have, say if we're pushing logs to something like the Elastic Stack, where we're pushing logs to maybe Logstash and it's going to an Elasticsearch index. In this video though, we're going to look explicitly at how to send logs from a .NET Web API to Amazon CloudWatch, which is a fantastic tool for observability on AWS. One of the nice things about CloudWatch is that it can centralize all of the logs that we have from our various resources in a single location. That's really easy to search. It's really easy to do downstream analysis on the logs, and it integrates well with lots of AWS services. So in this video, we're going to look at everything that we need to know to both configure nlog for a number of different types of targets, including the console and file targets that I mentioned, but as well how to create a CloudWatch target so that we can send those logs up to AWS and have that observability directly in CloudWatch. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into a simple API and set this up. We'll look step by step at how to get everything set up and actually view our logs in CloudWatch. So let's take a look. Okay, so here we are in a really small project. It has two parts. We have a server-side web API that we've built in .NET 6, or are building in .NET 6, and then we have a really simple client-side application that's written in Vue. And the concept is here that although it's a work in progress, the overall idea is that we're going to have a small gift shop where team members can buy gifts for each other, and they can do it through this sort of internal company gift shop. And so that's the idea here. Right now, the application is still really in the very early stages, and so what we have is a simple list view where we are making a request from our client application to our web API to get a list of the different gifts that we have available in our gift shop. And so on the right side, we can actually see the JSON response that's coming back. I'll try to zoom in a little bit. But here we're hitting localhost 5000, which is where our .NET API is hosted, /product, and we're getting back a list of products as a list of objects. And so we have this JSON response coming back. And what we want to do now is we want to actually set up logging for our application. And so we're going to look at the different ways that we can integrate logging using a really useful logging framework called nlog. It's very popular. I've used it for many years with .NET projects. And specifically, we're going to look at how we can use nlog to write to Amazon CloudWatch logs so that we can have all of our logs aggregated in one place on AWS, which is going to be really convenient later on when we're trying to debug various services that support our application. So with that, let's dive into the little bit of code that we have set up here and look at how easy it is to set up nlog. Okay, so here we are in the code. We have a really small .NET 6 web API set up. You can see that I have a few different CSproj or C# projects set up here. We have a test library, we have a data layer, we have a business logic layer, and we have some third-party wrappers. So what we have at this point is a really minimal, small, monolithic style web application, sort of a three-tiered architecture. We have the web layer here, which is where we have a number of different controllers set up. And then we have this program.cs file where we are essentially creating our web application, and this serves as the entry point for our web application. So the first thing that we need to do is to actually install some NuGet packages for both nlog as well as AWS nlog for CloudWatch. So I'm going to stop the application that was running in debug mode from our IDE, and we're going to right-click on Web, and then we're going to manage NuGet packages. So here I'm going to browse for nlog, and the steps that we're following here will apply to basically any .NET Web API that you have. So even if you're not working in this project directly, this video is really just meant to illustrate how to get set up, and it can be done basically at any point in the development of your web API. It's really easy to add nlog if you don't have it already, and it's really easy to configure a target for Amazon CloudWatch. You can see here I've already added these libraries, both nlog and nlog extensions.logging, and then we need to add the aws.logger.nlog library, and so you can see I've added that here as well. So anytime we're configuring nlog, what we typically want to do is to create a configuration file for nlog in the form of a file called nlog.config. So let's go ahead and set that up now. I'm going to close out some windows here, and then I'm going to click on the folder view, which I find it to be easier to add files, and we're going to right click on the web layer, and I'm going to add a new file here called nlog.config. And the nlog config is really just an XML file, and we'll take a look at an example XML file I have set up here. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in a sample nlog config file. This is a pretty simple configuration file. As mentioned, you can see that it is XML, and we have this parent node nlog. Now, one of the really important parts of the nlog node here is this internal log file attribute, which you can see is pointed to a file on my development machine. Now, this file nlog will write to for its own internal logging purposes, and this can be really crucial in debugging different types of errors when you go to set up new targets. So if for some reason there's a configuration error, or nlog can't for some reason write to a target that you have set up, it will, as a first measure of debugging, it will be really useful for us to be able to visit those internal logs, and so we want to be sure that this is set up and in a location that we know very quickly how to access. So then we have this child node targets, which itself is a parent for many target nodes. And a target you can think of as sort of an output for our logs. And targets can take many different forms. So if you're familiar with logging in general, we can log our logs to a file system, or we may wish to publish them to some network log aggregator that we access over some protocol like HTTP, for instance. We also often want to just be able to log directly to standard out and standard error on a console. And so we can do all of that using nlog with these target nodes. And so you can see here we have a file target where we're going to write to a file again. In this case, this will be our logs that we set up to log from our API and not nlog's internal logs. We can see also that we have this nice string interpolation syntax where we can interpolate very convenient values, in this case the short date format, so that we can sort of dynamically create these file names. This will come in really handy here in the next target when we look at how we could log to the console. And so here we have a really convenient colored console target, and we can see that we can interpolate other values like the long date. We can even interpolate some padding, the level of the logs, the call site, and this is really convenient for being able to view the particular method that is emitting the logs. We can choose to include the namespace, which can get kind of verbose depending on your project structure and namespace structure, whether to log out the file name itself and the source path. I've chosen here to log out the method name. And then our log message, of course, which can be interpolated with the keyword message. And then if we have an exception, we can also print that out to, in this case, a console. But you'll notice this is just provided by this attribute layout, which is on a target of type console. Now, this particular type of console does allow us to have some additional features added here, which is, in this case, just changing the foreground and the background color of our logs, depending on whether or not they are trace, debug, info, warn, error, or fatal level logs. And then the focus of this video ultimately is how to write logs to CloudWatch. And so in this case, we have an AWS target. We don't need this XSI type here. but the name of this target we're calling AWS, and we need to specify a type, and so we have this new type AWS target that we can use, and then we can provide a region, and then we provide a profile here. So as we'll see in a moment, we're going to need to set up an IAM role that grants this particular application the ability to actually publish logs to CloudWatch, which is going to require us to have an access key and a secret key for AWS. And so we're going to register those under a profile in our AWS credentials. This way we don't actually have to have our credentials published with our log configuration, which would not be a good idea. We need to specify a log group, and we'll see in CloudWatch how we can look at our logs by log group. And then again, we have the same layout here. We won't focus on this next section much, but it is useful to know from an nlog perspective how we can set up various rules to choose, how we choose to actually write logs to different targets. So it's not necessary for us to write the same logs to every target. We can set up rules here and sort of siphon logs off by level and then choose where they write to. And we can access them by name, which is why we have the different name directives or attributes here. Okay, so if our AWS target is set up properly, we should now be able to head into AWS itself, and we'll set up an IAM role for our application. Okay, so here we are at the AWS console. I'm going to head into IAM so that we can set up a new user, which is going to basically be our nlog agent. It's going to be a user which just has the permissions only to essentially write to CloudWatch. And so we're going to go ahead and create a new user. We can click users here or on the dashboard itself, and then we're going to add users. Here I'm going to call this nlog user, and we're going to set this up with programmatic access only. So we're never going to use a sort of a password to log into the AWS console with this user. We're specifically going to be acting programmatically through this user. And we'll set up permissions. We're going to attach policies directly, and we're going to create a new policy. We're going to do this via JSON for the sake of simplicity here, and you can see that we're essentially going to have the effect of allowing this particular user, or the user who inherits this policy, with a set of actions, including creating a log group, creating a log stream, putting log events, and describing log groups for any of our log resources. We can supply some tags for this policy if we want, and then we can review it. I'm going to call this, actually specifically this is really for CloudWatch logging, and we're going to say allow CloudWatch logging. Let's go ahead and create the policy. Now that our policy is created, we can head back to where we were going to attach the policy directly, and we can refresh, and I'm going to search here for allow nlog, or rather allow CloudWatch. We can select the policy here. Again, we can add tags to the user if we like. I'm going to go ahead and review and just go ahead and create this user. Now this is going to give us the opportunity to copy our access key ID and the sole opportunity to copy our secret access key. So what I'm going to do is, for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to set up a new profile on this development machine with the appropriate name for that profile as we saw in our nlog configuration, and we're going to provide the access key and secret access key to that profile. So for that we need to head into our credentials file. Now I'm going to use Vim here, but feel free to open this particular credentials file in any editor that you're comfortable with. It should be at relative to your home directory .aws/credentials, and you may have existing profiles in here. For instance, maybe you have your default profile set up here. What's important is that we add a new entry here for, in our case, a profile named CloudWatch-logger, and it doesn't really matter what you name this as long as it corresponds to the profile attribute that you provided in the definition for our AWS target in our nlog config. So you can see here CloudWatch-logger. So we've named this CloudWatch-logger. And now we need to provide our AWS access key ID and our secret access key, which we have open. So I'm going to copy the access key. And the secret access key. Now I'll go ahead and save this. And now what we'll do is we'll actually set up the logging in our program.cs file. So we can close our nlog config and we can head into program.cs. Now you can see in this particular program file we are handling our dependency injection here with this configure services method. If we take a look down at what that looks like, this is a convenience method that's been added to this project where we pass the service collection and the configuration manager to add the mappings from the interfaces to their concretions here for dependency injection purposes. So I think I'd like to set up something very similar for configuring our logging in terms of a separate method. So let's go ahead and say configure logging. And here we can pass builder.logging. And we can actually just go ahead and create this method down below. We'll say void configure logging. And builder.logging is a type iLogging builder. And what I'm going to do here is say logging builder clear providers, which is going to clear those default logging providers if there are any configured, and we're going to say logging builder add nlog. This is going to require us to bring in nlog.extensions.logging, so we'll add that using statement, which we can see here. Okay, now that that's set up, we can take a look in an example controller, for instance. So let's go ahead and head into our product controller. Pretty standard controller. We can see that at the standard /products route here, we have a logger that's been injected here, and it's of the type of this particular controller, and we're simply logging out fetching all products. So what we've done is we have called configure logging at the entry point of our application before the application is actually running. And we have set up an nlog config file to create a number of different targets, including a file target, a console target, and notably for this video, an AWS target that's going to publish our logs to CloudWatch. So let's go ahead and start up the application. Head back here, we're in the web project. I'm just going to say .NET run. Okay, so we're running here. We don't have any logs output yet, other than the warnings that we got for async methods, which are not fully implemented yet. Let's go ahead and hit our API and refresh and see if we get logs to the console. So I'm going to open a new tab here. We're going to go to localhost 5000 /products, or /product rather in this case. And so we are making a query. If we refresh our UI, we're also making a query. And we can see that when we do that, we're actually getting logs out to our console. So every time I refresh here, we are getting logs that we're fetching all products. So that's a good sign. Next, let's check our file logger, which dumps logs to our file system. So here we are in ctemp. We have internal nlogs as well as our application logs. And I'll bring this over. We can see here that we're getting some additional info logging here out to our file logger. We can see, for instance, EF core is being used to execute queries against a backing Postgres database that we have set up. So it's nice to be able to see those logs. And now let's check in CloudWatch. We can look at how we can actually find the logs in CloudWatch from the AWS console. So I'm going to head back into CloudWatch, and we're going to select log groups. So here we have this Mindful Gifts API, and we can see a number of different logs which have been written very recently to our log group. And so we see those events here, and so we get a nice set of logs that are now being aggregated to a single location in CloudWatch. So this will ultimately be really useful for us as our application grows, has much more complex business logic. It's going to give us a way to very easily analyze logs and observe logs over custom time periods. This is going to be invaluable for us from a cloud native perspective as well when we have lots of infrastructure hosted in the cloud for this and other applications. So this is just a quick example of how to set up logging using nlog. I would like to actually flesh out this sort of sample gift application that we have set up here over time. So I hope you've enjoyed sort of an intro to this small application. We're going to work on this as well as the Cloud Native Library application on this channel over the next few months, sort of flesh things out and see a number of different ways to develop specifically for .NET running on AWS. We'll look at much more in terms of topics regarding observability and logging along the way. But as a start, I hope this is useful for you for integrating nlog and publishing logs to CloudWatch using nlog for your own applications. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.